China's State Security Department investigates and handles, in accordance with the relevant Chinese law, groups, people, and activities that harm China's national security interests and effectively performs its duties. As for China's State Security Department performing its regular duties, I do not make any further comment.
The Chinese government has systematically identified, captured, and killed up to 20 informants working for the CIA, effectively crippling America's spy network in the country. The New York Times reports that China started targeting the agents as early as 2010 when the informants were outed. How their identities were uncovered is not exactly known. Some theorize that there was a mole in the US government. Others think hackers targeted the CIA's communication systems. And a few believe the US intelligence community has been sloppy in protecting its sources. Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is former CIA operations officer Philip Giraldi. Thanks so much for joining us. So it was a compelling New York Times read. I'm sure you read it as well. Was there enough proof in there that this actually happened and that China killed CIA informants?
Well, I think it's quite clear that it actually happened. The question is, how did it happen? And there are, of course, a number of theories that are being floated. The one of there possibly being a mole is the most attractive in terms of a story. But I have a feeling that what we really saw here was a case of incompetence in terms of how the CIA communicated with its agents in China or how it recruited them.
And so incompetence is probably the most plausible in your eyes. Tell me why. Is the CIA that incompetent?
Well, the CIA is no more incompetent than other intelligence agencies. And you have to realize that the fundamental problem for an intelligence agency after it recruits someone and sends them into a country that has a high security level is how do you communicate with them? And communications are very often the downfall. There have been a number of these cases where whole networks of intelligence assets, we would refer to them as, have been either arrested or killed or otherwise maltreated because the communications failed. I would think that in this case they were communicating electronically with their agents in China. And of course the Chinese are quite good at electronics themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now it seems as if they weren't foreign spies or even US citizens. It seems as if they were Chinese nationals. That's what I'm getting from the New York Times article. Does that mean that they are of the highest value possible because they are actually Chinese citizens?
Well, that's a difficult assessment to make. It depends very much on who they were, what the intention of having them was. I think certainly there would be spies in terms of the Chinese defense industries, the Chinese nuclear program. Hopefully you would want somebody who would have access to political decision-making, that sort of thing. But it's difficult to judge.
Yeah, so at least a dozen killed and 18 out of the 20 remaining imprisoned, according to the report. But then, you know, there's some other various theories regarding the numbers. Would the U.S. have done the same to Chinese spies?
Well, of course, I would hope that the U.S. would not kill them, but it certainly would do its best to identify them and arrest them and put them in prison for the rest of their lives. So this would be the commensurate action by the U.S. government. But certainly spying is serious business, and it's a high-risk business. So it doesn't surprise me at all to read this report, to hear about this possible Chinese action.
And we're talking about a 24-month period from 2010 to 2012. There's been 5 years since then. Has there been any noticeable shift in the relationship between the United States and China? Is there anything you're thinking of and going, that makes sense now, given that we know this happened in 2012?
Well, again, I think you would have to know who the spies were and what kind of access they had. I certainly haven't, but I'm far from an expert on Chinese matters. I follow the Middle East a lot more and developments in Europe. So I would suspect there certainly must have been some things that in retrospect, if we knew who the spies were, we would realize that decision-making was different. At least one hopes so, because that is the reason why one has an intelligence agency in the first place.
Yeah, so the Chinese haven't really come out and kind of admitted to this fully, but they've been dangling a few interesting things out there. There's an editorial in China's Global Times. They don't have the freest press out there. This is an excerpt of what was said in there. If this article is telling the truth, we would like to applaud China's anti-espionage activities. Not only was the CIA's spy network dismantled, but Washington had no idea what happened and which part of the spy network had gone wrong. It can be taken as a sweeping victory. Is that just, normal propaganda, or is there something more to that?
Well, it's partly propaganda. It's partly patting themselves on their own backs to show what a good job they did. But, as I say, spying is a high-risk business. It's for the people who do the spying, it's seen as something that's in the national interest, and that is a preemptive, offensive step against countries that are adversaries. For those who are on the receiving end of spying, of course, it's seen quite differently. It's seen as the ultimate betrayal. It's seen as treason. Mm-hmm. So I think depending on where you're reading the article, that will be the spin you'll get.
Yeah, and I want to kind of rewind and go back to what you said about sloppiness and suspecting maybe a communications mishap or using that as the way to communicate with the spies. Is the CIA behind all the other networks when it comes to this sort of thing? I mean, we saw the North Koreans hack Sony, and we've seen other countries get involved in this. When it comes to hacking and when it comes to communications, digital communications, is the CIA no longer at the cutting edge of this?
Well, the CIA is almost certainly at the cutting edge of this, but so is everybody else. I mean, these technologies are accessible to anyone who has the time and money to invest in trying to develop systems and develop ways to break them. So this is what to bear in mind. And I think the other point that I made is should be something you should be thinking about. The CIA basically recruits its agents in certain ways. And, if you figure out where the way is or what the mechanism is, for example, if the Chinese had arrested a scientist who studied at Stanford, they will suddenly start looking at all people who went to Stanford to study. It's kind of you set a pattern, and once the pattern is set, it makes you vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. And politically, when we watch Hollywood movies about spies being found out and so on, we understand a lot of them through the context of the Cold War. When we read about or watch Soviet spies and American spies, we think, okay, there's a Cold War between these two superpowers. That's why they're spying on each other. In this day and age, does America need to be spying on China, who's not a foe? Maybe it's not a great ally, but it's not a foe. Does it need to be spying on China at that level with that depth of penetration?
Well, this, of course, is a long-running debate in the United States that the intelligence agencies are much too big, they try to do too much, and they spy when it's not really a national interest. And this leads to embarrassment when agents are caught, when agents are executed, more than embarrassment when they're executed. So I would say that the United States does indeed spy too much. It should be spying in terms of its own interests, but they have to be clearly identified interests and not just random operations going out to collect information. That really is not very important.
It's been great to tap into your experience, Philip Giraldi. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.